Hi, I'm Jess. Today we're opening up on ceremony for enthusiasts, iconoclasts, anarchists, and you. Today we're welcoming, and I'm so excited, Professor Howard Williams. And it says on here, qualifications are BSc in Archaeological Science, MA in Burial Archaeology, PhD in Archaeology. So that's just for starters. And teaching research in death, burial and commemoration, the early Middle Ages and public archaeology. He has this amazing blog called Archaeodeath. You must look it up, and I will put all the stuff in the notes at the bottom. But absolutely brilliant and fascinating. Leader 4, I didn't know what this meant. MRes, is that Masters of Research?
Yes, it's a Master of Research qualification, so yes.
Yeah.
Hello, yes. Hi, Jess.
But there's more. Like archaeology, and he's contributing to MA Archaeology of Death and Memory. Module Leader 4, Contemporary Past, Empire and Aftermath Archaeology of the First Millennium AD. Vikings, Death and Burial, Empire and Aftermath. Yeah. And all these contributions to all kinds of things. I mean, I could be here all day. I'm feeling like you're squirming already.
Nah.
All right, I'll keep going.
Yeah.
Also
I like to feel
contributing.
important. I'm an academic.
I love that. Okay. Also contributes to teaching of the following undergraduate modules: Introduction to the Archaeology of the British Isles, 10,000 BC to 1900 BC. Debates in World Archaeology, Archaeology and Contemporary Society. Module Leader 4, postgrad stuff, research skills in archaeology and heritage, mortuary archaeology, whatever that is, landscapes and memory and research. So I think you're an absolute coup, and I cannot believe my luck that you came on and you decided to spend some time with me today. And it's just so brilliant. I never thought you'd answer my email, actually, when I sent it. So I'm thrilled and I'm excited
It's
to
a
hear what
pleasure
you
to be
have
here.
say.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, you're so much fun as well, and I'm pleased to meet Sandy. So I'm going to start off with what would be your favourite ceremony that you've ever been to?
Myself, I don't think I've enjoyed any ceremony I've ever been to. I mean, as a professor of mortuary archaeology, which is the study of death, burial and commemoration in the human past, I end up analysing every ceremony I'm at, and I always feel rather awkward. I suppose one type of ceremony I like to go to are my own students' graduation ceremonies. And here at the University of Chester, we have our graduation ceremonies twice a year in the Chester Cathedral. And we have, it's a very great pomp and circumstance, high church. We have trumpeters, and we say, God save the, is it now? What are we supposed to, who's God supposed to be saving? The king, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. But actually, I'm sorry, being silly, but, we do all that, but it's actually a good moment to celebrate the students, despite it being a bit cringe and over formulaic. It's a good moment to see the students graduate. So that's a ceremony I force myself to enjoy, and I do enjoy. I sincerely, all the hard work of our students, archaeology students have, a tough time. It's a tough degree, but it's a great degree studying the human story from early times. But of course, there's so many people willing to undermine what a degree is in today's world, and they need a moment of celebration. So, if you wanted one answer, it's graduation ceremonies. Despite the formula and the hype and the branding of the university, it is actually a good moment to see the students finally get that public recognition.
I never thought of that. That's really interesting. I was really interested in your thing that you did. Was it Stonehenge you went to, or was it Glastonbury? And you did a thing when we last spoke, and you'd been to see something that had moved you quite profoundly. And was it sunrise? Was it?
Oh, I tell you what that was. That wasn't. I didn't think of saying that because it wasn't really a ceremony. It was just a gathering. Because it was. That's a really good one actually. Because I suppose by accident it became a ceremony because. Obviously, many pagan people and many other people want to celebrate the midsummer solstice, sunrise and sunset. And I went, many people go to Stonehenge, right? So Stonehenge is packed, and they open it up, and for that morning, that night and morning, it becomes a massive jamboree of people celebrating the rising of the sun, and then it's cloudy, and everyone goes, "Is the sun up? Yeah, it's kind of up, yay!" And but I've never done that because I don't have a particular spiritual belief. But I did this year accept the invitation to go to Salton Hall, which is near Wem in Shropshire, and to be there for the sunrise at a very distinctive modern monument. And this monument is basically called the Salton Long Barrow, and it's a modern version of a Neolithic and New Stone Age megalithic chamber tomb. And we know these from across Britain, and they were built by the first farmers to house their dead. But the idea came to a Wiltshire farmer about a decade ago. Why don't we build a modern one inspired by these first farming people of the British Isles, over 6,000 years ago, or about around 5,500 years ago? Why do we build a modern one that can be a columbarium, where you can put the ashes of your loved ones in? So, it's away from a modern cemetery, and he built his on his farmland. So it's not trying to look like, it's not like a replica of a prehistoric monument, but it's inspired by that sense of being away from a church, away from a cemetery, away from the standard paraphernalia, right? And he built his down in Wiltshire. And now a company called Sacred Stones have been building other ones. And the Salton Hall Long Barrow is aligned, it's got its main chamber aligned on the midsummer sunrise. And so I wanted to go there to see the phenomenon of the light entering in through the passage, and this, which is a phenomenon that prehistoric tombs did. Some prehistoric tombs were aligned on the midsummer sunrise, midwinter sunrise, and other key calendrical dates, so that the sun would enter into the space of the dead at a very specific moment. Anyway, so that's what the architecture is all about, right? And I went down there just to see it, just to be there. And other people were there. The owner of Sacred Stones business was there, who's got the name Toby Angel, which sounds made up, but he's really called that. He's a lovely chap. And the farmer was there who set it up, Tim Ashton, and who owns Salton Hall, which is a wonderful 16th century mansion in itself, and you can B&B and hotel type thing. But anyway, I went down there just to see it, and there was a group of people there, and it was just, so it wasn't a ceremony, but everyone obviously was instinctively behaving as if they were at a church service or at a funeral. They were waiting for the sun to rise and waiting for this moment. And it was a kind of, it wasn't a spiritual moment for me, but it was a special moment. Yeah.
It was a shared experience, wasn't it, as well?
Exactly.
That's amazing. A shared experience, a gathering, and something that kind of had a sense of the sacred about it if people were starting to behave like that.
And you knew that you were in the presence of the sun doing something special, and you were interacting with not just a monument that's aping prehistory, but is a modern, whatever you think of that as an architectural space, is a modern mausoleum. It's a modern columbaria. And we were standing next to little niches in which the ashes of, many of them are empty still. It's only a few years old, but we were in the presence of the dead, and I think we should always be respectful and of that presence. And so I think it was a very powerful moment. Yeah. So I particularly don't have any strong personal beliefs, but I'm always observing and always thinking as an academic about these spaces. But that doesn't stop me also having respect for and feeling part of these kind of ceremonies.
I love that. I love that story. Okay, do you have an absolute worst nightmare ceremony in your mind that you might have seen?
Yes, I've talked about this on my blog, and it was a nightmare ceremony. It wasn't my ceremony, and it was another death ritual. Is I went to a funeral of a family friend who I'd met a number of times, who passed away very young, and they were very connected to the local community and to they had a big following. They were a young person, right? So they were in their late 30s when they passed away, with young children, therefore the connections of a young mother to family, but also she's involved in local sports clubs. And so there were some international rugby players turned up, and sort of local celebrities within that the local club, and also they played internationally, and their network. So that the crematorium which I was visiting for the ceremony was just too full. It couldn't cope. And so that had real implications. It's not about ruining it, because it's not about that. We will all go to a ceremony for the dead, and we couldn't even get in the crematorium. So parking to the crematorium, which crematoria have been designed over decades to have good vehicular access, right? But the car park was packed. The lane approaching the crematorium was packed, double parked, and you could hardly get down the road. And then the lane leading to that lane, and then people were trying to park on the main roundabout on the A road leading to it, and then walking up about half a mile to the crematorium just to be there to honour and be there for the moment. And they piped it. I didn't realise this. Crematoria have speakers for those that can't get in, or they have speakers for outside.
Yeah.
Most people couldn't even hear that. And because the crematoria is next to a hospital and they have an air ambulance station, half the service was blocked over by the sound of the air ambulance taking off or landing or practicing or whatever it was doing. So I suppose at one level, my reflection with an academic hat on is this is a rare example where, most cremation services, most people are of a certain age. Maybe they'll be lucky if family turn up or there's any family, and, the space has all these empty seats. And it was really shocking and, disturbing and moving as well, to see a space that just couldn't cope with a capacity audience, because so many people wanted to come there to honour this young person's life. And, I didn't object. I'm not saying, it was horrible. It was my visitor experience was damaged, or, like a tourist trip advisor, not going to your crematorium again. It was a bit too busy. I'm just talking about the how obviously we paid our respects, we did our job, we turned up, but we never even got in the door. We saw the coffin arrive, we saw it go in, and we just gathered like a crowd of about 80, 90, up to 100 people outside, probably about 60, 70 people in the atrium, and then a packed chapel. I don't know what the capacity of the chapel would have been, 250, I'm making figures up, But my point is, there were like 3 layers of mourners: the people who got in to be there in the service, the people in the sort of atrium outside, and then the people who was literally under a canopy while it started to rain, actually, at one point, trying to hear bits of the service via a tiny, tinny speaker, competing with the sound of the air ambulance. And I suppose I just want to share that as an example because, and I'm not criticising the crematorium or anybody, this unpredicted public gathering, unpredicted in scale. I mean, it's a scheduled funeral, but it's unpredicted. No one can gather or manage that. You can't manage these spaces. And as an archaeologist who studies funerals in the past, I think that's very revealing, because no matter how much you try and organise anything, you can't control people, you can't control dogs and animals, particularly cats and pets and animals, but also you can't control adults in that scenario. What could of who turns up and who wants to pay their respects. So for me, that was really revealing, because most past funerals are not orchestrated in any regard. They would have been very much more loose and informal events. And so as an archaeologist used to thinking about ancient times, that really got me thinking.
So then normally in the past, people would just meet outside or in an unsheltered space, or one of these massive like these barns that they had in medieval times. Big communal space.
It would have varied considerably. It depends on when you're talking about. I mean, a lot of the time we don't know. So if we're dealing with, say, the Middle Ages, of course, a church service and a burial outside. But if you're dealing with, there may have been a whole series of other issues, depending on if it was a high status person, they may have wanted a ceremony in a cathedral, and there may have been a choice of burial location between the parish church or various, churches that are patronised by that elite family in different parts and districts, through to royalty, which we knew that in the Middle Ages, all sorts of things were going on with the royalty. They were embalming in the Middle Ages, various, there were, I think of, who was it? Whose body was it? Henry the First, or was it Henry the Second? Was so putrefact. They had to bring it back from Normandy, and it was so rotten, and people died at the stench and stuff. My point is, if you want to do anything elaborate with funerals in the past, you either burn or let the body deflesh, and then you move the bones, or you have to do things pretty quick, because bodies go rancid pretty quick if you don't have access to cold conditions or a morgue. So we can at least organise. So time sensitivity is something we've been able to manipulate in the modern culture, because we've got morgues, we've got freezers, we've got that ability to. Sadly, old Mr. Parkinson died, and the funeral's next Tuesday. In traditional societies, it's today or it's tomorrow. It's very quickly, unless you can put him in an ice store, or you can put them in a. So the time sensitivity, how the news would have got out. People would ride to nearby villages, and it would have been much a community event. Even if you didn't like that person, you'd be there.
Really? You'd have to
I
go?
Think so. Well, there'll be different levels of social obligation, I think. And in some societies, some non-Western societies, of course, the obligation is to do to other families. So there's always not just simply priests, but there'd be people who would organise a wake, or people who would organise, and the obligation would be shared. So you wouldn't expect the the son or the daughter of the dead person to do that work, someone else would do it, and it'd be reciprocal. So next year, when their grandma dies, you take on that work. So I think funerals are labour, funerals are social obligation, and funerals, but they're community things, and they can be moments where tensions and conflicts take place or there's various delicate balances between, well, I'll go along but I'm not saying anything, or I'm going along but don't expect me to carry the coffin, or and you can imagine that is as true of human nature from the dawn of time right up to today. And I can imagine you've got many experiences of dealing with fractured families and from weddings to funerals. But I think that is one of the constants of humanity, isn't it? But it was just the unpredicted volume of people, I think, is something we still can't manage and control. And that was almost like touching. That was a connection to prehistory, to early times, that here we have a modern facility that's there designed to manage death as a process and cremation, and it just couldn't cope with the number of people who want to be there.
It's often because it's the person who's young, and quite often younger people have more people in their society, their community. It's also partly on the funeral director to try and anticipate that a younger person dying in that way will need a larger venue. So there are kinds of ways in which you can foresee.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I am interested in what you said about communities and families being responsible for one another. That does still happen in the Jewish community and in Muslim societies.
Yes, that's true.
It's just so interesting how little that's true in my own culture, in white British culture now.
Yeah.
It's kind of not about you. It's not about the community left behind. It's about the people who died, so it doesn't matter. So there's all that stuff that we talked about around direct cremation and about the history of that. But there's so many things I want to talk about, and you're definitely going to come back, aren't you, and talk about your new book and everything.
Oh, I'm happy to. Yes, absolutely.
I'm excited for that. We talked a little bit about direct cremations, and we also talked about the donkeys, which I've promised some of my listeners already, the tale of the donkeys. So we'll see how much we can cover, but it would be really exciting to just share with them. People just light up. Every time I say there's this guy, he's going to come, he's going to talk about the donkeys and the memorials. I'm like, yes, that sounds really great. Tell us a bit about it.
Okay. So as an archaeologist, I study the story of the human condition, the human past, the human journey from earliest times right up to the 20th, 21st century. People think of archaeology, they think ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, but archaeologists study all periods and places, and there are 50, 60 years of archaeologists studying the 19th century, the 20th century, right? So just to prepare you, so some people think archaeology is just stuff before history, prehistory, right? Archaeology is a study of all human periods through our material remains, through the stories of stuff, through the stories of things, through the stories of architecture, through the story of landscape, right? And as a specialist, I've tended to do a lot of my research on the early Middle Ages, so the 5th to 11th century AD or CE, as you prefer, in Northwest Europe, particularly Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, right? But I've also, over the last 15 years, done, and I've got more research coming on looking at contemporary deathways from an archaeologist perspective. And this isn't about digging up the recent dead. Don't get worried. Though obviously archaeologists sometimes get involved in investigating recent burials. Archaeological methods get involved in forensic investigations, crime scene investigations. There's a lot of cross-fertilization. Even in this country 25 years ago, the police were using techniques that no archaeologist would dream of using, so poor. And there's been in the US and America and so on, a lot of feeding of archaeological technique and method into what the police and their specialists do, but also war crimes, that type of thing. But also what I do is nothing to do with that. I'm not digging up the modern dead. I'm observing our material cultures.
I'm really excited to hear about that. So archaeologists feed into forensic science in the contemporary era.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
So even in the Cromwell Street Fred West case, that was heavily criticised, I understand. I'm not an expert in this. Heavily criticised for the poor police methods of trying to find the victims. And we're talking about Moors murders right up to Cromwell Street in Gloucester, even into recent living people's memory. The techniques used by the police have been substandard, and they've vastly improved thanks to increasing cross dialogue with archaeologists. So I know commercial archaeologists in the UK who in their career have been excavating a Bronze Age site ahead of a housing development just outside Oxford, and the next month they're in the former Yugoslavia excavating, as part of a war crime investigation, excavating mass graves, identifying the individuals from their dental records, from their DNA. Now, this is where archaeology is relevant to the present, but it's not just that. We have a broader role of contributing to conversations about our environment, about material culture. So archaeologists have been doing stuff on plastic pollution, right? So we've been able to contribute to discussions of how people are discarding their rubbish, how they're throwing away their masks, and big contemporary issues. And one of the areas I feel I've done a lot of work on is one of the areas where archaeologists can bring their perspectives, their methods, their techniques is the study of death and death spaces, from crematoria, churchyards, cemeteries, and so on. But one study I did, and it was not, when I say study, it was a little more than me doing a kind of walking around, scratching my chin, taking digital photographs surreptitiously with permission, and then writing it up as a reflection, was to go to the donkey sanctuary in Sidmouth in Devon, which is one of our premier animal sanctuaries, dedicated, as you can suspect, to donkeys, and has been running for a long time. And I did a study of how that charity and its paddocks and its farm, it's an open, free to visit, cafe, it's a lovely site. Go and see donkeys, they're lovely, right? How it's serving this purpose of saving the animals, giving them a place to live, facilitating a place for people to go, but it's also a complex memorial landscape, because not only are they memorialising the dead donkeys, when the donkeys die, they get memorialised there with plaques and a statue and all sorts of other paraphernalia to remember the much-loved donkeys that were saved from Spain or from a farm in Dorset or wherever. They've been saved from a cruel life and brought to a place of safety. But when they pass on, they are then remembered and they're named animals. They're not just arbitrary creatures. They're personalities and so on. Not only that, but a lot of people want to be remembered there. Lifelong visitors, people who support the donkeys. And so they've got, many of their paddocks have trees, lines of trees around them. And also many of the farm buildings have just walls of memorial plaques commemorating dead human individuals in relation to the donkeys that were loved by human individuals, and also pets of those human donors and supporters of the charity. And so you've got this space that's a really complex, and it captures, I think, so much of our broader early 21st century relationship to death. It's a secular space. It's no longer a religious space. It's a charity space. It's a space where it's about animals. It's not just about the animals themselves. It's about people's love of the landscape, the paddocks, the walks where they went with their dog and walked every day. And therefore it's become a really interesting mix-up of memorialising animals and people, and pets and donkeys. Donkeys are pets in some ways, but people may have had a donkey but could no longer maintain that donkey, so the sanctuary takes it over. And that relation, the people, the owners aren't necessarily the cruel people who mistreated the donkey. They may be the people that still, loving the donkey when it's gone to the sanctuary. So there's a complex life and death mingling there. So I did a piece in the Journal of Material Culture back in 2011 called Ashes to Asses, an archaeological perspective on death and donkeys, where I used lots of silly puns, which was supposed to be just a bit of fun, to explore the many dynamics of this landscape. So I talked about how I gave an introduction to how zoological spaces, animal spaces are such an important part of human healing and leisure and entertainment, but also about mourning and remembrance, and how I talked about it's a sanctuary space, an asylum for people to sort of feel healing and curing through emotional well-being of being close to these animals. It's an assemblage of mortuary material culture because it's a collection of memorials in a space, and it's a landscape with aspects, so you can look out over the vistas of the landscape and enjoy the landscape, and it has a place called a Field of Dreams, which is their garden of remembrance. So like you can imagine the donkeys are in a dreamlike state, almost like over the rainbow bridge, this metaphor people use for animal death. And so you're almost walking in a real landscape that is an idyllic sort of garden where animals are. You can imagine maybe my dead animals are off in a similar paddock. It's so beautiful. It's a natural landscape, but of course it's totally human made. It's hedges, fields. There's nothing natural about this. It's like all our work landscape, our farmed landscape. This is a human construction, right? So then I talked about the memorial benches and the commemorative aspects of them, assuagement, and then I talked about how the donkeys almost have a dead community as well. The donkeys all have names and memorials. They're an association. And some of the donkeys are asinine ancestors, because some of the really famous donkeys that were perhaps part of the story of the sanctuaries or founding, they are part of the sort of ancestral community. They're like the chief donkeys. They're like they're sort of remembered as the sort of the founders, and their salvation is the founding, as well as there are memorials to Dame Thora Hurd, the sanctuary founder Edie Svensson. The great and the good of the charity are also commemorated there. So you know what? Looking back at this article, I think it's really quite a cheeky article in my use of punning, but and I obviously ended with an assessment of why this matters and what this matters to the broader context of humanity and what we're doing with our dead. And I suppose I was just making the point that it's distinctive, but it's not unique. This is the Donkey Sanctuary is one, but it's not. I'm not trying to treat it as a freak show, as a weird. Oh, isn't this weird? I was trying to say, with all due respect, this is telling us something really interesting about our broader society. How we've really unshackled ourselves from the church during the 19th and 20th centuries. Not unshackled, but I mean, many people still value and are connected to churches or other religious organisations. But death is now out in the landscape. It's in the cricket grounds. It's in the football grounds. It's on the lovely walk along a cliff top. It's in all these other kinds of landscapes and places. So that's the kind of problem we're facing. My phone is going and I've got to try and shut it down.
I was just wondering about so many things, like when you're not an archaeologist, of course, and you think about death culture in history, your go-to is always Egypt, which is probably very narrow. Yeah. But I was just thinking about animals in death culture in Egypt, and wondering really whether what you're describing here is very British, right, as of it's clearly very now. But I'm just wondering if it's very British, because we are a bit silly about our animals in some ways, or other people might think we are. I've noticed a lot when I'm doing funerals, especially during COVID, when everybody bought pets, that they are becoming increasingly important, and meeting them at home and saying their names in the funerals, all of those things are just really, really important in the UK. I don't know whether this is a global thing, whether it's a luxury in our society. I just wondered what you thought about that.
I don't have a detailed, up-to-date knowledge of all those matters. All I know that I have been seeing research papers by other archaeologists talking about our British story of relationships with pets and death. And I think COVID has brought this particularly to both our relationship with the human dead and with pets has intensified everything. Our inability to do traditional funerals and to reflect on isolation and so many aspects that it links to pets. And but what I have seen is that this is a broader debate, and colleagues and archaeologists and historians and others working in Germany. I've just read a paper recently about Finnish pet cemeteries and how so there's broader patterns here. It's not just us, right. It's a broader Western, if you want to call Western phenomenon of our secular relationship with mortality that's mediated through animals, a lot of animals. And I've also done research on zoological gardens, looking at how they do this, mainly because I spent so much of my time in Chester Zoo with various offspring, looking at animals. But I'm going, oh, look, there's a memorial there. And, so how...
And they're like, oh my God, here he goes again.
Yeah, can't stop me. You can see that, the people who sponsor the animals, some people are sponsoring the animals in zoos for themselves to be donated, but also to remember others. So they're sponsoring the tigers to remember John and Jack Bird, or Mabel and Doris, or whatever, great aunts or whatever, and they're putting the memorials on the sponsorship plaque. So you have a mixing of the living and the dead on the sponsorship plaques, by the giraffes or by the tigers or by the elephants or by the stick insects or whatever it be. Not many people like to be memorialised in association with stick insects, which is sad because they're lovely. But my point is, there are favourite animals, aren't there? The animals that are more likely to be seen as having individual personalities, chimps, gorillas, not just simply great apes, but also some particular animals, equines, elephants are particularly popular, that we have in our stories.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that is, when we're mourning the dead in our human spaces, even if we can't include the animal dead, we want to represent them. So if someone kept 15 German shepherds all through their life, a German shepherd is a motif for the gravestone. Or if they're a pigeon fancier, a pigeon's put on the gravestone. And of course, for children, it's not simply animals, it's the toys of the latest Hollywood film. So I remember I did a blog post about the first time I saw Frozen on a child's grave.
Right.
I saw an Elsa toy, and you hit a moment where you're hitting a generation of people who, and but also it's animals. So you have your Winnie the Pooh, and you have almost like animals that are from Disney films are so many generations back from the tragically short life of that child, and yet that is the connector, that is the binder between the grandparents, the parents, the other siblings, and the child is a Winnie the Pooh that was, I don't know when Winnie the Pooh came out, but it was like 1940 whatever, isn't it?
Well, I never thought of that. And I've got a ceremony coming up where Winnie the Pooh is the final words, not "we commend you to the ground" or any of the religious stuff, but Winnie the Pooh's words at the end. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. That's amazing.
So people talk about, so I suppose my point is, I'm an archaeologist, I'm interested in time and tradition. We're talking about now, people say, oh, it's modern stuff. No, but this is like 4 or 5 generations deep, depending on how you count your generations. And I get confused with all these Gen X millennials. I don't even know what I am anymore.
No, I don't know what I am either.
No, best not worry about it, is my view. But my point is, however you rate these fictional generations, we're 4 or 5 generations of Disney alone. And then there's other older versions of that. There's Alice in Wonderland. There's, and I see these representations on children who could never have grown. Some of them, you look at the dates and you realise this poor little perisher never got old enough to probably even play or even understand what a Winnie the Pooh film or book was. And yet that is the medium with which that fictional bear is being used, or even Mickey Mouse and things that, why was that a thing? We're talking about a grave from sort of 2007, Mickey Mouse, that was clearly not, it's interesting how tradition, that is somehow a tradition that's deep in time already, and it may, and in my terms as an archaeologist, that's really interesting to see how familial traditions or social traditions are coming from things that we would call modern, but actually are many generations deep already and are being used in tragic circumstances of remembering a child. So animals are so important for that mediation of between the living and the dead, between family members and pets, and that's really fascinating. I'm not a sociologist, and maybe I'm not using the right terminology here, but I find this stuff really interesting because it relates to material culture. And so if you go to the zoo every second Sunday or whatever it may be, and say one of your siblings dies, and you're still in your 30s, but you want to remember at the zoo, that's the place you want to remember. And so I think what we're seeing is that the entirety of our landscape is becoming saturated with the dead. The dead are no longer trapped or, corralled within cemeteries and crematoria. The dead are everywhere.
That's
so
amazing.
Our university campus has memorials to students who sadly died, either during their time of study or afterwards. And the university campus is the place where the memorial has been erected. So I suppose it's really important to, there's nowhere you can go where you can't find a memorial bench or
and what's challenging about that in terms of the general discourse around death that deaf professionals will purport is that, it's a taboo. Death in our society is a taboo. And I really don't think it is. And you're telling me that it isn't, I think.
No.
If it's
that's
around
nonsense.
us even more than it was before. But you do hear it a lot. It's like a standard trope.
Yes.
And you don't agree with it either.
No, it's nonsense. I mean, the idea came up in sociological literature as Gora, wasn't it, in the 60s? And the idea was trying to make the point that death has replaced sex as the new taboo. And there is a truth that a sociologist would be able to articulate this better than mine, but I think the point I would make just off the bat is death has become invisible, managed, secularized, medicalized Yes, but that's not taboo. That is, and many people have never stopped and are continuing to find new ways of continuing the dialogue with the dead. An ongoing conversation that may last a few days, may last months. And I say conversation, I don't necessarily mean the standard Hollywood trope of sitting at a gravestone like Rambo talking to Adrian or whatever it is, and all these other films where there's always a grave scene, a personal dialogue between a romantic love across the grave, right? That is one, but there are many other people who want the dialogue, the material dialogue with urns on their shelves, a place that's important for them, an object or a souvenir that's important to them, and it's not always formalized in a gravestone or memorial. And when it is so many different varieties that we have in so many different places. So that's
tell me what you mean by material world. What does that mean in this context?
Okay, so we are mediating death. One of the discourses about death being taboo is that death is out of sight, out of mind, out of material tangibility. And yes, our relationship to the grave as the place of the dead has become really complicated. But that doesn't mean that we don't think of death as material or corporeal. The grave may not be the place, but things may be the mediators with memory. So an heirloom, an object that was treasured by that person. But often, a lot of our work with material culture with the dead is about keeping a very small number of things and distributing, sharing, dumping, recycling a lot of the crap in people's houses. All of that is working with the material world to place the dead and to displace the dead, to make decisions about what do we want to keep, what do we not want to keep, what do we want to remember. Photographs are another material medium. While photographs are often digital, they often exist in physical spaces. So there's been a lot of discussions about how over the last century, the birth of photography in the late 19th century has created a new medium outside of the grave, but also you can have photographs on the grave or etched onto graves. But you know what I mean? Photographs that are outside the grave where people mediate their remembrance of the dead. So photography is material because it's a visual, but it's a material framed object.
This is like a whole thing, a whole other podcast, because actually now people video themselves before they die. So if you're watching this, then I've died. So they keep the video and then you watch it after they've died. So that's a whole other topic, isn't it? It's another thing again.
But often I would say that even when the digital, death has gone digital for over the last, I don't know how long, 30, 40 years, as death has gone digital, people want to still create it as a space. So the cemeteries are online. They're still framed as a material space. So on one level, that's not material. It's immaterial, but another level, it's being framed as a material space. So there's been a lot of discussions about archaeologists working with digital spaces as physical spaces because they're set up by humans to be like physical spaces. So even a video or a photograph is in a folder, and a folder is a physical thing, isn't it, on your computer?
That makes sense.
So we are using a lot of. I'm not saying it works 100%, but even our digital engagements with death are framed around materials and spaces, which is what we study.
Yeah.
So yes, go on.
I feel like we could go on forever because it's so interesting, and it's not really what's being said in the public domain. What you're talking about is something really unique and really different, and brings a completely different perspective to my work, because there's a lot of judgment around death and how we do death, isn't there? We should be doing it this way, that way, and it's all gone to pot.
Well, academics are not here to tell you what to think. We're here to make you think. And I think that's one of the things I try to do. So with I'm talking on, whether I'm talking on social media or publishing my work, which no one reads, but you know what I mean?
I will.
But you know what I mean? When you're doing a very small audience specialist piece of academic work, or whether you're talking on a podcast or I'm doing a blog post, I'm trying to get people to think. I'm not saying I have done posts where I've said, my word, what's going on here? One of the things I've been quite critical of, almost in a comedic way, is the remembrance gigantopoppies, the giant hogweeds, or the sort of triffid versions of poppies, and how people have monumentalized poppies. So now some war memorials have these huge, almost like giants, sort of like 50 centimetre, 80 centimetre wide poppies they stick in, made of metal or plastic. And you're just going, this has gone a bit silly now.
They're like the ones from the Tower of London, aren't they? From that.
And then there's the numbers of small poppies and these great fields of poppies flowing over. And this is, at one level, I think this is interesting. Another level, I have passed judgment on that. And I'm just using an example where I've broken that sort of. I said, okay, this has just gone a bit mad now. Or like pillar boxes with poppies on, crocheted on or whatever. I do go, this has gone a bit.
I'm not a massive fan of the poppy, but I have to say that there is so much that you can teach us. There's so much you can teach us, because definitely in my field of work, because we value what we do and we think ceremony is very important. And obviously in the church, the feeling is that the church is very important.
Yes.
And community is very important. I remember from our conversation before that we have a concept, don't we, that the community is breaking down and this kind of nostalgia for the past. But one of the things that stayed with me from our conversation was the way in which history comes in cycles. And so it hasn't always been the case that everyone has had a big funeral or that cremation has been off the table.
No, I think it's really interesting to see how the ancient past is used, because you made a good point earlier I didn't properly answer, which was, the ancient Egyptians mummified lots of animals. There's lots of ancient. Yes, this is nothing new under the sun, right? So one level, we've got to understand that past societies had different worldviews, different understandings, and we need to embrace that diversity. Just as we keep banging on about, you've got to get out of your own little, echo chamber and think about how diverse our own society is. If you're going to have that mentality, if you're going to, whether you call it decolonizing or trying to step outside of your own experience, not you personally, I mean just us. I wasn't talking to others, but if we do that with today, archaeology is one of the ways we understand and celebrate diversity of human experience, religion, culture, and so on. Right? Yet, also we have to see there's a lot of similarities. And we can find comfort, we can find example, we can find inspiration in the past. But my problem with the way that many of the funeral industry and many politicians use the ancient funerary record is fixation on the great and the good. And that somehow when we think of ancient Egypt, we think of the pyramids at Giza, or we think of the tomb of Tutankhamun. We think of the great and the good, who were exceptions, and that people who lived as poor peasants in the Nile Valley in the 2nd millennium BCE, or medieval peasants working on the fields of Yorkshire in the sort of 14th century, would have had very modest, humble funerals, or sometimes no funeral at all. And they, and we've got to remember that they were probably talking about, community isn't what it used to be. They could leave my door open back in the 14th century CE, but now in the 13th century CE, everyone's just nicking everything, no community, no respect. My point is everyone's going in these cycles, and we've got to be careful of that rhetorical use of the past, that everyone was respectful, everyone was giving lavish funerals, and, They were robbing graves, actually. Yes. And so, I suppose the great eternal thing is, remember, we've got to celebrate diversity, but humans have always had the limitless capacity to be kind and show reverence to each other, and the limitless capacity to be utter arseholes. And, and we have to just remember that trying to put the past on a pedestal, so to speak, as, they knew they had tradition back then and everything worked. No, it didn't,
It didn't.
But that should enable us in a positive way to think, we've got an opportunity here to think about what we're going to do with our dead. We don't have to do exactly what was happening. We don't have to constantly bemoan our situation. Yes, COVID was a horrid time for many people, and we had a family bereavement just before, or actually a week before the lockdown regs went in, which meant that the family member passed away. Thankfully, actually, because I think the hospital was just overwhelmed. And I think it was a blessing that they passed on just before, everything went south, so to speak, and they didn't end up in a nursing home. Thank God. But my point is, it was a sad time. But then we couldn't have a funeral, and all of the restrictions. And I was very vocal. There's a balancing act. I don't want to sound like one of these anti-vaxxing loons, but equally, I was very critical of the decisions to actually close public cemeteries and churchyards as spaces, as open air spaces where people could go and walk their dog, exercise, visit graves. I thought that was a grotesquely inhumane decision by councils and
I
authorities
agree
to do
with
that.
you. I agree with you. One of my worst traumas, actually, from having been a frontline worker in funerals during COVID, is the memory of security guards standing on the doors, turning away daughters. I will never forget it. And so, yes, yeah, really hard. I agree with you about it.
Gosh, that is. I mean, this is a story that needs to be told, and academics will hopefully, and other writers will, and podcasts like this will tell. But it's going to last. It's going to have a generations deep, I think, scars on.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think the very fact that it feels to me that we are only just starting to talk about our trauma, which is very typical, isn't it, of trauma? I'm hoping to get people on to talk about it. You'll know a lot about that probably from archaeology and how people memorialise later, I'm sure.
Yes.
That'd be really interesting as well. I feel like we could talk forever. But that's one of the things that I'm finding that people are just about ready to say. It's not so much, I don't want to ever talk about COVID again, which we had for a while, which is also very typical. There's a little bit more, speaking for myself, I feel like maybe I was a bit traumatized, kind of tentative conversations. And then someone else will say, well, actually, I've been really depressed. And the conversation is beginning. It probably won't come to fruition until about 10 years down the line, or maybe 15, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. When you have disasters, you see this too. Both the lobbying for recognition the disaster actually took place and who was to blame, and the inquest and so on, whether it's Grenfell Tower or it's anything else. There's a political, but then there's the actual mourning. And mourning, for some people, raising a proper monument to a tragedy is a closing act. It's a forgetting act. It's a moment of we've come to a point where we can finally put up a monument. And it can be 20, 30, 40 years later. Or it can be an act that is there to mobilise political action if it's being felt it's not recognised. So there's different ways in that way that works. But my point is, what applies to mass disasters, mass death disasters, also applies to individual families. And I think different families or communities will navigate this in different ways. But I think it takes years. I don't think we've coped with that death. This is true for any death, but I think the particular circumstances of not having a funeral. And then we were allowed a funeral a few months later, a memorial service, but then all with restricted numbers. And we said, well, who would come and why would we do that? And so it was kind of like there was an option, but we had a venue, but we thought, why would we do that for the 4 people or 6 people or whatever the restriction was?
That's right. And I'm trying to do a little bit of awareness raising around the fact that you can use a celebrant like me to do something really special somewhere important. So our conversations are really enlightening in terms of connection to place. And you talked a lot about that when we spoke before, about a sense of place and how death relates to place. So I think people having them in the back garden or dad's favourite place, if you don't have to have the body there because of COVID, you can actually use it to your advantage and do something that is more in tune in a way with what you're describing that we're currently doing in our contemporary society.
Well, I must say that on a personal level, I have to confess that while I study this stuff, I also feel absolutely a loss at how to deal with personal situations anymore. People said, oh, well, you're an expert in mortuary archaeology. You must, either be desensitized or so adept at knowing all the psychology and I feel completely at a loss. So in that case, I didn't try to organise anything. I actually said I was just supporting others' decisions because it wasn't really my decision to say, we're not doing anything.
Yeah,
we're not doing anything. And that was if it had been left to me or I'd been put in a position, because every family has subtle, depending on the relationships. I wasn't in a position where I could call it. But if I had been in a position where I'd call it, I may have still said, let's just leave it. Because I think you'd end up going there, having the service and seeing a big empty church or whatever it was and feel worse than if you had, as you said. And I didn't think about a celebrant or something like that, but I think that would be something that it helps to mediate between that sense. It actually could be more traumatic having a service where, but if you can contain the space, make it a space that's meaningful, but not have the pomp and ceremony or the expectation of attendance of a certain number.
Nice.
Yeah,
they're really nice. They have a lot of flexibility in them, so you can do anything. You can have grandson can come with guitar and play a piece of music, and you can have bunting, and you can have mum's pictures everywhere, and you can have her favourite flowers. You can pick them from their own gardens. It's all that. It's just lovely. So there are real positives coming out of thinking of death in a different way. And I love what you said about it still being material, because there's a feeling, we've lost the body, so all that corporal, that connection is gone. But actually it hasn't, because you've still got the place. And I think that's something really important to think about for myself.
There's a question back for you then. I mean, do you feel there's still a bit of a moral anxiety around the material and the corporeal, that people feel like dirty for feeling they need a material, that I should be just in some kind of Hollywood film spiritual, Simba looking up at his dad as part of the sky, and that's enough. The fact that I need a place, or I need a monument, or that it's something dirty or compromised, or I don't know. That's what I get. I get a vibe from some people I talk to. They feel like
I think there's both. I think this is something we need to find the expert on this, because that's a really important question that needs to be explored. There's definitely a sense of failing to do the right thing, or a fear that one won't do the right thing, and the importance of doing the right thing. But people don't know what the right fucking thing is. So they're like, should I have a burial? Should I have a direct cremation? Should we do nothing and honour her wishes and put her out with the bins? Or should we do something because we need to do it? Should we do something for that person or this person? Should we feel like we want to visit the body, or should we feel bad that we don't want to visit the body? So I think the big question is, how do we arrive at a sense of freedom, that there isn't a right way, there's only a right way for you, that's very contemporary speak, isn't it? I wouldn't be saying that 100 years ago. And that's all part and parcel of individualism, probably.
It is,
Yeah, so I don't really know. Carry on.
But I mean, I think it's really good that we don't have one set of gurus. Everyone's a guru now, aren't they? No, but it's like you don't go to the local priest. I may have shared with you an anecdote. I don't know if I did when we discussed before about going to a great uncle's funeral in South Wales when I was obviously from my accent, I'm Southern English, but Welsh family. My great uncle's South Wales, never left, and went to his funeral, and the vicar clearly didn't have a clue about him, and I remember this line of something like, "Yes, in his later years, Glyn enjoyed a good cup of tea and watching the television." And I thought, well, that's absolutely that's touchingly precise. Thank you for that insight.
But hadn't he been in the mines and everything? Had an amazing story.
Yeah, he'd been in the mines. I think he'd served in the war. There's things you could have said. I mean, that was a particularly desperate moment of, I'm just taking notes from and obviously I suppose the dynamic would have been perhaps the wife my great aunt wasn't in a condition to communicate about anything, and so the vicar was put in a awkward position. But my point remains that, my word, we've got to do better.
We've got to do better than that. We know that's a standard, isn't it? I think one of the things, this brings me back to my pet thing, which is that for me, it's about storytelling. For some of my colleagues, it's about the care of the body. For some of my colleagues, it's about the structure of the ceremony and rite and ritual and the history of that and how that works. And for someone else, it's about place. But for me, it's about storytelling. So I think if one can tell the story of the person who died, one honours human life and affirms it. And so that's where I come from. And then there's all the things around, where do we tell that story? What tells that story in the best way? Is it music? Is it place? And that's really where I've done before ceremonies where, so for example, I did a ceremony for someone who was a really well-known artist, and COVID. And then we had a meeting where we made a bit like a mosaic of pictures. So we all sat down and did a picture each, a little square, to make a big artwork for him as a memorial, and then that was going up in the gallery. And we had the ceremony in the gallery. Yeah,
that's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
And so many ways we can creatively use materials, creatively as in to think of ways of doing it, but also to creative as in acts of construction, but also, I mean, let's flip it around. There's almost nothing you can't do if your way of remembering is chucking a pile of their stuff on the bonfire. I'm not suggesting that's very environmentally friendly. I'm just using it as the first thing that came to my head. If that's what you as a family decide is the way you need to get, we're going to break up something. This is what a lot of societies in the past, breakage, destruction, or giving away, are acts of memorialisation. And some people feel very guilty about, look at their lovely porcelain mugs, just take them down the charity shop. I think we could do much more work to help people understand that there's always been a challenge and a problem, and that, it's like other people where it's finding stuff, almost doing an archaeological excavation of their flat or their house and realising, they actually did serve in the war. Do you know what they did? I didn't know they did this. Look at these photographs. And you're actually telling the story. You've done a piece of research on their life that they never told for whatever reason. I had a very moving, I don't want to go on too much, but I did have a moving one that I can share with you. It's another one that makes me think, is I did a video. We recently went to Northamptonshire to visit a friend for her birthday. And as I can't help myself, I was there for a birthday, but I spent most of the weekend going around archaeological and historic sites. And I went to a certain church.
You're quite strange. Yeah.
Am I? Okay.
A little bit. Like were you going around a graveyard?
Of course. You can't get to the church without going through the graveyard.
I completely speak as one taking one to know one. I once got stuck on a Venetian burial island. The island where they put the... Yeah.
You got stuck?
Was nearly. The tannoy was like, we really have to get you off this island now because this is the last boat. We're not going to get you out. So I am totally with you, but I do think we're both a bit niche. Not sure it's what most people do.
I went into the church and there's a memorial window to the US 6th Air Force who flew from the base nearby, right? So it's a memorial window. And I did a little video for TikTok of this memorial window, and I shared it with a few of my American friends. And one of them did a stitch of my video and said, "Thank you for sharing this, because my grandfather served at that base, and he never talked about the war. But I remember as a child sitting here, watching him sleep, reliving night raids on Germany as a bomber, and he'd be reliving this trauma. He never talked about it, but this is a man, a big creator actually on TikTok, talking about a childhood memory of his granddad who never talked about his service in the war, and it was triggered by a video of me going to a Northampton church and showing a memorial window. And I suppose, what's my point here? I suppose my point is that there's so many ways we can dig into our family history, our stories. It often happens after their death, and we find out things about them. And I'm not saying everyone has to do this kind of intrusive research, but just a place that can connect them to something they did or somewhere they went. And
I love that story.
And it can happen. That was by happenstance. I didn't know anything about this American gentleman and his relationship with his grandfather. I just thought, hey, this is cool. You might be interested in this because I know you said something about I've half remembered a video about something to do with, well, many people have military connections, but it doesn't matter. My point is, there's so many ways we can think creatively about using place, not necessarily places that are local to us, but places that are connected to the story of the person.
That's so lovely. I love that.
Yeah.
And I think there always has to be a place, for me, there has to be a place for those coincidences. There has to be a place for mystery, and there has to be a place for imagination. And then going back now to your stuff about Disney, about animation, about cartoon characters, the way in which that is an imaginary world. And the donkey sanctuary in the fields where the donkeys live, it's an imaginary world. We kind of pour scorn upon the imagination, and we do it at our peril, because in fact our imagination is really helpful in how we think about memorializing, how we think about death, and how we think about placing meaning on real life experience.
Yeah. If it's a biblical narrative, if it's metaphors taken from the Star Trek universe or whatever it may be, use it creatively to mediate your mourning and your loss. I think there's really so many potential ways in which we can think about places and material culture and not be snobby and not be prescriptive about it.
It's the snobbiness and the prescriptiveness I'm thoroughly against.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I've loved this so much. I think we've got 1 million podcasts, haven't we, ready to go? We don't know if I need to talk to anyone else, but it would be really good if you could... Well, there's loads of different topics, but yeah. Can you share with our audience what your big passion project is at the moment, what you're going to be coming to talk to us about next, about your book, about all of that? And I want you to tell people where they can find you as well.
Okay, so I'm Professor Howard Williams at the University of Chester, and as well as the usual university website, I run my Archaeodeath WordPress blog. So you can find me as Archaeodeath, one word, on WordPress or on social media, including YouTube and TikTok, where I have channels too. In terms of my ongoing projects, I edit an academic journal on not so much death, but frontiers and borderlands, called the Offers Dyke Journal. It's an open access journal, and I've just published volume 5 of that, in which I've got my first another topic, first reinterpretation of Britain's longest ancient monument, Offa's Dyke. But my other big book that I'm just about to send off to the publishers is a book called Cremation in the Early Middle Ages, which was the last time in Britain's history and Europe's history where burning the dead was popular before the 19th century reinvention of cremation. And so it's an edited collection of all the leading experts who've worked on cremation, including I'm doing a joint introduction. And that book is going to be off to the publishers, go through peer review because it's an academic book, and it hopefully will be out early next year. But it's called Cremation in the Early Middle Ages, edited by Femke Lippok, who's a Dutch researcher at the University of Leiden, and myself. But I've got other book projects I'm going to be writing. I want to do a book on the Vikings. I've got another book on early medieval monuments. And I do want to do a book at some point about contemporary death, the archaeology of contemporary death. But that's for the future.
Well, I'm so excited. So so that's really, really good about the cremation. So hopefully you're going to come back and tell us a bit more about direct cremation and the history of that.
Yeah,
and
I think that'd be
really
interesting.
A bit more launching your books because we want to see you on the shelves.
Yay! Yes, thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you, and I've learned a lot as I've gone along. It's interesting to hear your perspectives. It's fantastic.